All right, so Germany between 1918 and 1945. Huge changes, right? We're talking about World War I ending, the Weimar Republic, and then, of course, Hitler and World War II. We've got school lesson plans here, historical overviews, even some stuff from a journalist who was actually in Germany in the 1930s. Should be a good one.
Yeah, it really is a fascinating period. You see a whole country trying to rebuild
Yeah.
after a brutal war, and they have to figure out a new political system at the same time. It's like a recipe for instability.
Yeah, no kidding. So it's 1918. Germany's in chaos. The Kaiser takes off. They lost the war. And all of a sudden, they're a republic. Talk about a wild ride.
Absolutely. And not everybody's happy about this new republic. I mean, imagine it. They had a monarchy for centuries,
Right.
and then poof, it's
Right.
gone. And they've got this brand new democracy. So you've got the elites who want the old system back.
Sure.
And then you've got these extremist groups on both sides, the communists on the left and the fascists on the right, and they want to just blow the whole thing up.
So in the middle of all of this,
Mhm.
you've got the Social Democratic Party, the SPD. They're trying to make this parliamentary democracy work. What were some of the biggest problems they had to deal with?
Well, one of the first things they had to deal with was a threat from the far left. Just a few months after the war ended in January 1919, we see the Spartacus Uprising, this communist revolution led by Rosa Luxemburg and Karl Liebknecht.
So why communism? Why did that appeal to some Germans at that time?
Well, Germany was really struggling after the war. Lots of poverty. People couldn't find work. There was this feeling that the old ways had failed.
Right.
So communism, with its promise of equality and workers having more power, it offered a completely different way of doing things.
A radical alternative.
Exactly. It appealed to the people who felt like capitalism had let them down.
Well,
People who wanted a fairer system.
so the Spartacus Uprising shows just how unstable Germany was back then. But it failed in the end. What does that tell us about how strong the Weimar Republic was in those early years?
Well, the fact that the uprising failed shows that the Republic, as shaky as it was, still had support from important institutions, like the military,
Right.
but it also shows how divided German society was and how dangerous those extremist ideas still were. The Republic was walking a very fine line.
And on top of all those internal struggles, Germany also had to deal with the Treaty of Versailles. Talk about kicking somebody while they're down.
Yeah.
This treaty blamed Germany for World War I, and it led to resentment and economic problems. That would have a huge impact on the country for years to come. Can you talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, the Treaty of Versailles was a major turning point. Germany had to accept that they were responsible for the war, and they got hit with these huge reparation payments. They
Yeah.
lost territory, and they weren't allowed to have a big army. All of this created a deep feeling of resentment and humiliation.
Yep.
It made people angry and nationalistic, and it really undermined their faith in the new republic.
And in this atmosphere of resentment, we see the rise of this stab-in-the-back myth. The idea that Germany didn't actually lose the war, but that they were betrayed by their own government. How did that myth spread so widely, and what kind of impact did it have on how people saw the Republic?
It was powerful propaganda. It played on people's fears and frustrations.
Yeah.
It gave them someone to blame. It let them shift the blame away from the military and put it on the shoulders of this new government. They said the government was weak and incompetent.
Okay.
And the right-wing groups,
Mhm.
including the Nazis, they really latched onto this myth. They used it to make the Republic look even worse and gain support for themselves.
So you've got the Treaty of Versailles causing all this resentment, and the stab-in-the-back myth making things even worse. And then on top of all of that, the German economy completely falls apart.
Exactly. The economic crisis in the early 1920s was a direct result of that treaty. Germany was really struggling to pay those reparations,
I bet.
and it led to France occupying the Ruhr region in 1923.
I know it was a big deal.
It was a huge blow. The Ruhr was Germany's industrial heartland.
Right. And what did the government do? They printed more money, which led to hyperinflation. That wasn't just a little economic blip. It totally messed up everyday life for regular people.
Yeah, you're telling me. Imagine your life savings suddenly becoming worthless. People needed wheelbarrows full of cash just to buy bread.
Wow.
This economic chaos just eroded what little trust people had left in the Weimar Republic. They were desperate for solutions, and that made them vulnerable to those extremist ideas.
Sounds like a recipe for disaster.
Huh.
So we've got post-war Germany with all this chaos, political turmoil, a terrible economy. This all sets the stage for something bad. Where do we go from here?
Okay, so we've seen that the Weimar Republic is in deep trouble. But then in the mid-1920s, things seem to calm down a little. For a bit, at least. Did things actually get better, or was that just like a break before things got even worse?
Well, in 1924, the U.S. came in with this plan, the Dawes Plan. It was supposed to help Germany get back on its feet
All right.
and ease up on those crazy reparation payments.
They restructured the payments, gave Germany some loans, and tried to stabilize the currency.
So for a few years there, it looks like Germany might actually pull through. The economy is recovering. People are feeling a little more hopeful. But I'm guessing that didn't last.
Yeah, you're right to be skeptical. The Dawes Plan helped in the short term, but it didn't fix the underlying problems, like the structural issues in the German economy and the fact that people still hated the Treaty of Versailles.
Yeah.
Plus, it depended a lot on American investment.
Oh, I see where this is going.
Right.
And then boom, the Wall Street crash of 1929, the Great Depression, and Germany gets hit hard.
Exactly. The Dawes Plan falls apart, unemployment goes through the roof,
Yeah.
and the Weimar Republic is barely hanging on.
And that's where Hitler comes in.
That's right.
He was so good at propaganda.
He was a master at it,
He exploited all that misery and offered these simple solutions.
which were also really dangerous.
Totally. He played on people's fears and prejudices,
Right.
blaming Jews, communists, and the Treaty of Versailles for all of Germany's problems.
And people bought it,
It's scary how easily people can be swayed by someone like that.
especially during a crisis.
For sure.
Hitler gave people a scapegoat,
Right.
someone to blame, and he promised to make Germany strong and proud again.
A return to greatness.
Exactly. And his message worked. By 1932, the Nazi Party was the biggest party in the Reichstag.
Wow. So they had a ton of influence. Let's talk about how Hitler actually came to power. There are a few key moments that stand out, like the beer hall putsch in 1923. What was he trying to do there? And how did it help him, even though it failed?
The beer hall putsch was this crazy attempt to take over Bavaria.
Wow.
It was a total disaster.
Okay.
And Hitler ended up in prison,
Yeah.
but his trial gave him a national stage,
Mhm.
so more people heard his ideas. And while he was in prison, he wrote Mein Kampf,
Oh, wow.
which laid out his whole twisted ideology.
So prison was like a publicity boost for him.
In a way, yeah.
And then in 1933, there's the Reichstag fire. How did that help the Nazis gain more power?
The Reichstag fire was a turning point. The Nazis used it as an excuse to crack down on everyone.
Oh, wow.
They suspended civil liberties, arrested their political opponents. It was basically the end of any real opposition.
And that paved the way for Hitler's dictatorship.
Exactly.
And just a few weeks later, on January 30, 1933, Hitler is appointed Chancellor of Germany, the Weimar Republic is dead, and the Nazi regime begins. How did they manage to dismantle a democracy so quickly?
Well, they were really good at propaganda and intimidation.
Right.
They took control of the media.
Sure.
They shut down anyone who disagreed with them, and they created this atmosphere of fear.
Wow.
They appealed to people's patriotism and their desire for order.
Right.
But at the same time, they demonized their opponents, and they blamed minorities for everything.
Like the Jews.
Yes.
And one of the most horrifying things the Nazis did
Yeah.
was the systematic persecution of Jews, which culminated in Kristallnacht in 1938. That wasn't just some random act of violence, that was a planned attack on Jewish businesses and synagogues all across Germany.
Kristallnacht, the night of broken glass, was a terrifying turning point.
Yeah.
It showed that the Nazis were willing to use violence on a massive scale,
Right.
and it was a preview of the horrors that were to come.
The Holocaust.
Exactly.
So while all of this is happening inside Germany, Hitler's also got his sights set on expanding German territory and dominating Europe. He remilitarizes the Rhineland, annexes Austria, and demands the Sudetenland from Czechoslovakia. What did the other European powers do about this? Did they try to stop him?
At first, Britain and France tried to appease Hitler.
Appease him?
Yeah. They thought they could avoid another war by giving him what he wanted.
Oh, wow.
They figured if they gave him enough, he'd eventually be satisfied.
And that didn't work out so
They backfired.
big time.
It just made Hitler bolder.
And then September 1st, 1939, Hitler invades Poland.
And that was it.
It was the start of World War II
It was.
and a turning point. Not just for Germany, but for the whole world.
It was the beginning of one of the darkest chapters in human history.
So we've seen Germany go from a defeated nation to an economic disaster,
Yeah.
to a breeding ground for this hateful ideology. And now they're starting another world war. What happens next? We left off with Hitler invading Poland. That's the start of World War II.
Yeah.
What happens next? How does the war actually go for Germany?
Well, in the first couple of years of the war, Hitler used this strategy called blitzkrieg. It was all about speed and overwhelming force. They
Hmm.
used tanks and planes and fast-moving infantry, and they were able to conquer a lot of Europe really quickly.
Yeah, it's amazing how quickly they took over all those countries. Poland, Denmark, Norway, the Netherlands, Belgium, even France fell in just a few weeks.
Yeah.
Hitler and the Nazis must have felt invincible. Did that early success maybe contribute to their downfall? Like, did they get overconfident?
Maybe. It's possible that all those victories made them arrogant. Maybe they started believing their own propaganda about
Yeah.
how the Aryan race was superior and how the German army couldn't be defeated.
Right.
That could have led to some bad decisions later on.
Like invading the Soviet Union in 1941.
Yeah, that was a big one.
Why did Hitler break his agreement with Stalin and launch Operation Barbarossa?
Hitler had always wanted to conquer the Soviet Union.
Really?
Yeah, he saw it as living space for the German people,
Okay.
and he thought that all the resources there would make Germany even more powerful.
So he was going for total domination.
Yeah, pretty much. But he made a big mistake. He underestimated the Soviets.
Oh, so.
He didn't think the Soviet people would fight back so hard, and he didn't realize how strong the Red Army really was.
And fighting on the Eastern Front was brutal.
It was a nightmare. It was a war of attrition.
What does that mean?
It means they were just trying to wear each other down. Both sides lost tons of men and resources.
Wow.
And the Eastern Front was huge. The Soviet Union is massive.
Right.
And the winters there are super harsh. It was a logistical nightmare for the Germans.
So the Eastern Front really took its toll on them.
It was a major turning point, the beginning of the end for Germany.
And then in December 1941, Japan attacks Pearl Harbor, and the U.S. enters the war.
That changed everything.
How so?
Well, the U.S. had a ton of industrial power and resources.
Right.
So now Germany was fighting a two-front war against the Soviets in the east and the Americans and British in the west.
They were stretched way too thin.
Exactly.
So the Allies start to gain the upper hand. And then in June of 1944, we have the D-Day landings in Normandy.
D-Day was a huge turning point.
For sure.
The Allies finally had a foothold in Western Europe, and from there, it was just a matter of time.
Until Germany was defeated.
Right.
And the war goes on, the full horror of the Holocaust becomes clear. The Nazis systematically murdered 6 million Jews
Yeah.
and millions of other people they considered undesirable.
It's a truly horrific chapter in human history.
It's hard to even comprehend the scale of it.
It's a stark reminder of what can happen when hatred and intolerance are allowed to flourish.
And when people turn a blind eye to what's happening around them.
Abs-
So the war in Europe finally ends in May 1945. Germany surrenders unconditionally. The country is in ruins.
Both physically and morally.
Yeah. What happens to Germany after the war?
Well, the Allied powers occupied Germany, and they had to figure out how to rebuild the country and deal with the legacy of the Nazi regime.
It must have been incredibly difficult.
It was. Germany was divided, the economy was shattered, and there were all these psychological scars from the war and the Holocaust. But the German people are resilient. They started rebuilding their country and trying to come to terms with their past.
It's an incredible story of resilience and transformation. So we've seen Germany go through so much in just a few decades, from defeat in World War I to the turmoil of the Weimar Republic, to the rise of Hitler and the horrors of World War II. It's a reminder of how fragile democracy can be and how important it is to fight against extremism and intolerance. We need to learn from history so we don't repeat the mistakes of the past. If you found this deep dive helpful, be sure to like, subscribe, and leave a comment. We'll be back soon with another exploration of history, helping you understand the world a little bit better.
All right, let's jump into another deep dive. Today we're looking at Germany between 1945 and 1961.
A really pivotal time.
Yeah, really fascinating stuff. We've got a great mix of sources for this one. Videos, educational materials, even some personal documents. It's going to give us a real feel for what it was like.
Looking forward to it.
Me too. You know, going through these sources, I was really struck by the sheer scale of the challenges Germany faced after World War II.
Yeah.
I mean, we're talking devastation on every level, physical, political, economic.
Absolutely. 1945, Germany is in ruins, cities bombed out, millions dead.
And on top of all that, you have millions of Germans, the Heimatvertriebene, being expelled from former German territories.
Forced from their homes, trying to rebuild their lives in a country that's, well, barely even a country anymore.
Exactly. And then you've got the division of Germany into these 4 occupation zones, each controlled by one of the Allied powers.
Mhm.
The U.S., USSR, Great Britain, and France.
Right. And from the start, there's this underlying tension, this mistrust between the Western Allies and the Soviet Union.
It's like the seeds of the Cold War are already being sown right there.
Yeah, you can really see it in the documents you sent over, disagreements over how to rebuild Germany, what kind of government it should have, what its future role in Europe would be.
The Western allies are pushing for democracy and a free market economy.
Well, the Soviets want a communist system, a one-party state.
And it's not just about economics, is it?
No, it's about ideology. It's about security. The West is terrified of communism spreading across Europe, creating this domino effect.
The Truman Doctrine really highlights that fear, doesn't it?
Hmm.
The U.S. pledging to support any country threatened by communist expansion.
Absolutely. And then you have the Marshall Plan, billions of dollars pumped into rebuilding Western Europe.
A massive undertaking.
It was. And what's interesting is the plan was actually offered to all European countries, including those under Soviet control.
Really? I didn't know that.
Yeah, but Stalin saw it as a threat, a way for the U.S. to exert influence in Eastern Europe, so he blocked it.
So the Soviets, they're tightening their grip on Eastern Europe. The U.S. is pushing back. And Germany is right in the middle of it all.
Like a pawn in this giant geopolitical chess game.
And then, in 1948, things escalate dramatically with the Berlin blockade.
A real turning point.
Tell us about that.
Well, the Western Allies introduce a new currency in West Germany, the Deutschmark.
And the Soviets see this as a direct challenge.
Exactly. They respond by cutting off all land access to West Berlin.
Basically, they're trying to starve the city into submission.
In a way, yes. Food, fuel, medicine, everything had to be brought in by air.
The Berlin airlift. What an incredible operation.
For almost a year, cargo planes landed around the clock, keeping West Berlin supplied. It was a huge logistical challenge, but it showed the Soviets that the West wouldn't back down.
A real test of wills.
It was. And ultimately, the blockade failed. But it had a lasting impact. It hardened the divisions between East and West and made it clear that Germany would be a focal point of the Cold War for years to come.
So by 1949, we have two German states. The Federal Republic in the West, a democracy aligned with the West.
And the German Democratic Republic in the East, a communist state under Soviet influence.
Two Germanys, two very different paths. And this is just the beginning.
Yeah, two Germanys, completely different paths. It's really, it's fascinating to see how they each deal with the legacy of the Nazi regime.
Right, the denazification process. We've got some really interesting documents on that.
Absolutely. And it's not just about, punishing the top Nazis, the Nuremberg trials and all that. It's about trying to root out this ideology that had permeated, German society for over a decade.
A huge challenge, right? How do you even begin to deprogram an entire nation?
Exactly. And the approaches taken by East and West Germany were quite different.
Well, yeah, in the West, you had these efforts to remove former Nazis from positions of power, to kind of, rebuild the justice system, the education system.
And there's this emphasis on individual responsibility, on coming to terms with the past.
Which is, it's admirable. But at the same time, I mean, looking at some of these personal accounts, you see that it was also a very, very difficult and often painful process.
Absolutely. And it wasn't always successful. I mean, there were definitely cases where people who had been involved with the Nazi regime managed to escape accountability.
Right, they slipped through the cracks.
Yeah. And then in the East, it's a whole different story. The communist regime basically uses the Nazi past as a way to legitimize their own rule.
They're saying, we're the real anti-fascists, trust us.
Exactly. And they use it to justify, their own repressive measures, the Stasi, the secret police.
It's like they're replacing one totalitarian regime with another.
In a way, yes. But with this added layer of ideology, this Marxist-Leninist ideology that's supposed to be the answer to all of Germany's problems.
Right. And meanwhile, people are living in this climate of fear and suspicion. I mean, you've got neighbors informing on neighbors, people afraid to speak their minds.
Absolutely. And economically, it's a struggle. East Germany's saddled with these huge reparations payments to the Soviet Union.
While West Germany is experiencing the Wirtschaftswunder, the economic miracle.
Yeah, fueled by the Marshall Plan, a focus on exports, free market principles.
So you have this growing disparity between the two Germanys.
Which, of course, leads to more and more people trying to escape from east to west.
And eventually it leads to the ultimate symbol of division, the Berlin Wall.
Yeah.
The Berlin Wall. It's hard to imagine, a city literally divided, a concrete barrier running right through it.
Yeah, for almost 30 years, it stood as this stark reminder of the Cold War, the division of Europe, the the ideological battle between East and West.
And it wasn't just a symbol, was it? It
Yeah.
had a very real impact on the lives of millions of people.
Absolutely. Families separated, loved ones unable to see each other. And for those living in East Germany, the wall represented a very real barrier to freedom.
Yeah. And yet, despite all of that, I mean, looking at these documents, these personal accounts, you see this incredible resilience, this determination to live, to love, to create, even in the face of such oppression.
It's really quite remarkable. I mean, in West Germany, you see this flourishing of art and literature. Authors like Günter Grass, Heinrich Böll, they're grappling with the legacy of the war, the challenges of rebuilding, the anxieties of the Cold War.
And in their work, you can see this search for identity, this questioning of what it means to be German in this new post-war world.
Exactly. And meanwhile, in East Germany, despite the censorship, despite the constant surveillance, you still see these glimmers of dissent, of creative expression.
Yeah, the documents you sent about the East German art scene, they were really fascinating. I mean, some of it is obviously propaganda, but there are these subtle critiques of the regime, these explorations of personal themes that somehow manage to slip past the censors.
It's a testament to the power of art, the need to express oneself, even in the most difficult of circumstances. And it's not just art. People found ways to connect with each other, to build communities, to resist in small ways.
It's inspiring, isn't it, to see that even in a system that was designed to control every aspect of life, the human spirit still found a way to shine through.
Absolutely. And I think that's one of the key takeaways from this deep dive, this look at Germany between 1945 and 1961. Yes, it was a time of division, of hardship, of political turmoil, but it was also a time of incredible resilience, of creativity, of the human spirit finding a way to overcome even the most daunting obstacles.
And those themes of resilience, of the struggle for freedom, they continue to resonate today, don't they? I mean, we see them in conflicts all over the world, in the fight for human rights and the everyday struggles of people trying to build a better life for themselves and their families.
Absolutely. And I think that's why it's so important to study history, to learn from the past, to understand the forces that have shaped our world.
Well said. Well, we've covered a lot of ground in this deep dive, from the ruins of post-war Germany to the construction of the Berlin Wall, from the clash of ideologies to the personal stories of those who lived through these tumultuous times. I hope you found it as insightful as I did.
Me too.
And if you did, please do us a favor and like, subscribe, and leave a comment. We love hearing from you. Until next time. Welcome, everyone. Today we're diving deep into a really pivotal period in German history. We're talking about the journey from Ostpolitik to German reunification.
A really interesting time.
It is, and to help us understand it, we've got some fascinating source material lined up. We've got Dutch educational videos and documents,
Okay.
and they span from the 1960s right through to the 1990s.
Right.
So we're really going to try to get a grip on this period of incredible transformation for Germany and for the world. I mean, where do we even begin with a story this big?
Well, I think you have to start by looking at the global context, you know? The world was a very different place back then. It was the height of the Cold War.
Right.
And it's hard to imagine now just how tense things were. I mean, take the Cuban Missile Crisis in 1962.
Oh, yeah.
That was a real turning point.
Absolutely. The sources really drive home how close the world came to nuclear war.
Mm-hmm.
It's pretty chilling when you think about it. But as you said, it was a turning point, and it kind of pushed both the U.S. and the USSR towards détente.
Right.
A period of, well, a bit less tension, at least.
Exactly. I think both sides were really starting to feel the strain of the Cold War by that point.
In what way?
Well, the Cold War was incredibly costly. I mean, we're talking about financial resources, but also in terms of, well, just human life.
Right, yeah.
The USSR in particular was struggling with a failing planned economy. People were facing shortages, basic goods,
Right.
while the government was just pouring resources into the arms race.
And it's in this context that Willy Brandt comes in with his Ostpolitik.
Right.
So this was a pretty bold move, right? To try to improve relations with East Germany and Eastern Europe.
It was. I mean, you have to remember that this was a huge departure from the previous West German policy. You know, Adenauer's approach had been to basically isolate East Germany.
Right.
So Brandt comes along and says, look, we need to engage with the East. It's the only way forward.
But he was walking a bit of a tightrope, wasn't it?
Oh, absolutely.
I mean, he was trying to build these bridges with the East while also maintaining West Germany's very strong ties to the West.
Right, the U.S. and NATO.
Yeah, exactly.
It was a delicate balancing act for sure.
Did it work, though?
Well, it's kind of a mixed bag.
Okay.
I mean, there were definitely some tangible improvements. For example, there were new agreements on travel and communication between East and West Germany.
Right, so more people could actually visit their relatives and stuff.
Exactly. And then there was Brandt's historic visit to Warsaw in 1970,
Oh, yes.
where he knelt before the memorial to the victims of the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising.
Wow.
I mean, that gesture was incredibly powerful. It was a symbol of reconciliation,
Yeah.
a recognition of past wrongs.
You can just imagine how emotional that must have been. I mean, that's incredible imagery.
Yeah.
But despite these positive steps, right,
Yeah.
German reunification was still a long way off. I mean, Erich Honecker, the leader of East Germany, he was still committed to keeping Germany divided.
Right. He was. But the seeds of change had been planted. And while Ostpolitik did a lot to improve relations,
Yeah.
I think it was the arrival of a new leader in the Soviet Union that really accelerated the winds of change.
Mikhail Gorbachev.
Gorbachev, yeah. His reforms, known as glasnost and perestroika,
Right.
they had a profound impact, not just on the Soviet Union itself, but also on its satellite states.
And that includes East Germany.
Exactly.
So for our listeners who might not be familiar, what exactly were glasnost and perestroika all about?
Well, glasnost essentially meant openness. It was about increasing transparency in the Soviet system, allowing more freedom of speech.
Right. And perestroika.
Perestroika meant restructuring, and this was really about reforming the Soviet economy, which was, well, it was incredibly inefficient and stagnant.
So, I mean, these were huge changes. What motivated Gorbachev to pursue them?
He knew that the Soviet Union was in deep trouble. The old ways simply weren't working. He recognized that reform was essential if the USSR was going to survive.
But that must have been an incredibly risky move for him.
It was. But he was willing to challenge the status quo, to take those risks in order to, well, save his country.
And those reforms, they sent shockwaves through the entire Eastern Bloc, right? Suddenly, countries like Poland and Hungary had a bit more breathing room. They could start pursuing their own reforms.
Exactly. And this terrified the East German government. They saw what was happening in these other countries.
Right.
And they knew their own grip on power was weakening. They tried to resist the tide, but it was a losing battle. And then 1989 came along, and things really started to heat up.
Right.
You had all this pressure building from every direction in East Germany. People were aware of the higher living standards in the West. You know, they could see it on TV, hear about it from relatives and friends.
I mean, the sources actually mentioned one German TV program
Oh, right.
that actually compared everyday life in East and West Germany.
Right.
And it showed this stark contrast, like everything from the size of their houses to the types of cars they could drive.
Yeah, and those images, they really had an impact. It wasn't just about material goods then.
Right.
It was about freedom, you
Right.
know, the
Maybe.
opportunity to make your own choices.
Live a better life. Yeah.
Exactly. And on top of that, you had the political reforms happening in other countries.
Poland, Hungary.
Yeah, exactly.
People saw that change was possible.
Exactly. It was like the Iron Curtain was starting to crumble. And then came the mass exodus of East Germans through Hungary to Austria.
Wow.
Thousands of people just risking everything to escape to the West. I mean, it was a desperate act,
Yeah.
but also a powerful symbol of just how much people wanted freedom.
It must have been a logistical nightmare for the East German government. I mean,
It was a turning point. They were losing their citizens, and their authority was being completely undermined.
and then you have the protests in Leipzig.
Right, those Monday demonstrations.
Yeah, they started small,
They did.
but they grew quickly.
And they showed just how determined people were to change their fate.
Yeah, those Monday demonstrations were really powerful. I
Yeah.
mean, it shows that people weren't afraid anymore to speak out, to demand something better.
Right.
It's really inspiring how these peaceful protests contributed to the fall of the Berlin Wall.
They did. The pressure on the East German government, it just became too much.
Yeah,
And then on November 9th, 1989,
big day.
they made the announcement that changed everything.
Oh, yeah.
The opening of the Berlin Wall.
It was a moment of pure joy, wasn't it?
It was.
I mean, people were just pouring through the checkpoints.
celebrating.
Celebrating, yeah. The images are iconic, right? People chipping away at the wall, dancing on top of it. But amid all the euphoria,
Yeah.
there must have been this sense of uncertainty as well.
Oh, of course. And reunification wasn't just a party. It was a huge challenge. I mean, how do you merge two societies
Right.
that have been separated for over 40 years.
Completely different economic systems.
Yeah, different mentalities, different experiences.
Yeah, and the sources actually highlight some of those challenges. I mean, the economic disparities between East and West Germany, they were pretty significant, right?
Oh, they were huge.
A lot of those state-owned companies in the East, they just weren't viable in a capitalist system.
Right, that led to high unemployment,
Yeah.
social unrest.
Yeah, I've talked to people who lived through that period,
Yeah.
and they describe it as this time of both excitement and anxiety. It was a new beginning, but it was also a time of great uncertainty.
Exactly. And that process of integration, it's still ongoing today. It's a reminder that the legacy of division and reunification, it runs deep. And it continues to shape German society in all sorts of ways.
So we've gone from this policy, Ostpolitik, right, aimed at easing tensions during the Cold War to the fall of the Berlin Wall and this complex process of reunification. It's quite a story.
It really is. And it raises some interesting questions about the long-term impacts of such a momentous historical event.
It's amazing to think about, over 30 years since the Berlin Wall came down. But the effects of that division and then reunification are still being felt.
Oh, absolutely. It's not just a German story, though, is it?
No.
I mean, the fall of the Berlin Wall, it had this huge impact on Europe as a whole.
The whole world.
Yeah, marked the end of the Cold War.
A new era.
Yeah, exactly.
But what about Germany's role in this new Europe?
Right.
How did reunification affect that push for European integration?
Well, I think it's important to remember that even before reunification, West Germany was already very involved in that whole project. I mean, they were a founding member of the European Economic Community.
Right, which became the EU.
Exactly. And they really saw European integration as this way to strengthen ties with the West and to promote peace and prosperity.
And it worked. I mean, West Germany's post-war economic recovery was incredible.
It was, yeah. They became this economic powerhouse.
Yeah.
A symbol of the success of the European project.
But of course, East Germany had a very different experience.
Right, they were part of the Soviet bloc, members
Yeah.
of Commun. Right.
Which was based on central planning, state control.
Yeah, a world away from the market-driven economies of Western Europe. So when Germany reunified, it brought these two very different systems together.
Right.
What kind of impact did that have on the European Union?
Well, there were definitely some concerns.
Like what?
Well, some people worried that a reunified Germany would become too powerful,
Right.
that they might try to, dominate Europe,
Yeah.
sort of hearkening back to some darker times in their history.
Right. Understandable.
But German leaders at the time, people like Helmut Kohl,
Yeah.
they were very aware of these concerns, and they worked hard to reassure their partners.
How so?
Well, they emphasized their commitment to a unified Europe.
Working within the EU.
Exactly. They saw a strong, united Europe as being essential for peace and stability. And they were willing to make compromises.
Like what?
Well, like agreeing to adopt the euro.
The single European currency. Right. I mean, a lot of Germans were hesitant to give up the Deutschmark,
Yeah.
which was seen as a symbol of their economic strength.
Right. Makes sense.
But ultimately, they recognized that a shared currency was a crucial step towards deeper integration.
It's fascinating how Germany's role in Europe has changed over time.
It really has.
I mean, from a divided nation at the heart of the Cold War to becoming this leading advocate for European unity.
Yeah, quite a transformation.
It is, and it's still going on.
It is.
Germany's still a key player in the EU.
Absolutely. I mean, they're working to address all sorts of challenges.
Economic crises to the rise of populism.
Yeah, the whole range.
It's been an incredible journey.
It has.
I mean, from the Cold War to reunification and beyond.
Mm-hmm.
And it's clear that those events are still shaping our world.
They really are.
Well, on that note, I think we've reached the end of our deep dive.
It seems like it.
But hopefully we've given everyone some food for thought, right? This fascinating chapter in German history, how global events and political decisions and just individual actions can really shape the course of history.
That's true.
Well, we hope you've enjoyed exploring this with us. Don't forget to like and subscribe to our channel
Yes.
for more deep dives. And be sure to leave a comment below. Let us know what you think about the legacy of German reunification.
Yeah, we'd love to hear from you.
We would. We'd love to get a discussion going down there. Thanks for joining us.
Thanks, everyone.